Hi there everyone, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh, and it's great to be back after a few months in forced hiatus over the Christmas period of 2023-4. Today you find Ross, Widget, Gizmo and me in that Cotswold hinterland, north of Oxford, not really Cotswolds at all, built of the red ironstone, which is so incredible to look at we couldn't resist the diversion. That and the fact that the valley of the Cherwell is full of great little villages with fascinating stories to tell. We're heading up the A361 from Banbury, to which we will return soon, towards Daventry to visit the village of Wardington. As we near the village through which this road passes, we climb a hill called Calabo Hill. It gets its unusual name from an Italian clockmaker. Evans tells us a story as follows. Calabo was an Italian watchmaker who had left his native soil to escape the conscription of Napoleon and had been settled in Banbury for 40 years. He was a familiar figure in the villages and farmhouses of the district, which he was in the habit of visiting periodically to mend the clocks and to sell his famous weather glasses. At last, in the autumn of 1851, a nephew arrived from Italy to assist him in his business, and it was understood that the old man looked upon him as his successor. Young Calabo, however, seems to have thought that waiting for dead men's shoes was tedious work, and one evening in the following winter, as they were coming down this hill on return from one of their rounds, he drew a pistol and shot his uncle dead. He then hurried into Banbury with the story that they'd been set upon by footpads and that old Calabo had been killed. Suspicion, however, fastened upon the real culprit. The murder was clearly brought home to him, and he was hanged at Oxford Castle. Tipping our metaphorical hats to poor old Calabo, we continue north a short way where we find the village we're searching for. Until very recently, there were two distinct settlements here at Wardington. They're officially known as Upper and Lower Wardington, but the very recent building of the houses at Mount Pleasant, the Memorial Village Hall and the Greensward Housing Estate have joined Upper and Lower together. Some older residents refer to the two settlements as Ash Tree End for the main village of Lower Wardington and Old Barn End for Upper Wardington, after its beautiful old barn to the southwest of the village. Lower Wardington contains the church, so was probably always the principal settlement, and the church also acted as parish church for the village of Williamscott, locally pronounced Wilmscott, which we will visit briefly in a while. The ash tree, after which Lower Wardington is named by some, is historically famous, despite the fact that it has long since gone the way of all things, as the tree beneath which King Charles I dined on the day of the Battle of Croppery, the site of which battle we will also be visiting shortly. There are several buildings of note in this village. The barn we've already mentioned. On the A361 itself is Wardington House, built in 1785 as an inn. It has an inscription over the door which reads, "This house was built upon the place only as a mark of grace, and for an inn to entertain its lord a while, but not remain." The building was turned into a private house in the 20th century and is now a private nursing home. But the most spectacular house is about a quarter of a mile south-southwest of the village, called Wardington Manor. This beautiful house has had a checkered history, falling into disrepair on several occasions during its long life, but with amazing good fortune it has had a string of owners who have restored and repaired it with respect and sensitivity. It is particularly famous for its interior, which of course we will never get to see, and in particular for its extensive and luscious 20th century plaster work carried out in the 1920s by Mrs. Molly Wells. The current owners of this estate, which includes a wonderful walled kitchen garden, as well as several acres of formal garden, run a hugely successful cut flower business, supplying the grandest and most exclusive flower shops in London, as well as operating a flower bucket system for discerning locals. Garden designers by calling, it's hard to imagine a safer set of hands for a house like this to be in. Of the several pubs that used to exist in this village, only two remain: the Hare and Hounds, which belongs to the local Hook Norton Brewery, and the Plough, which, unless I'm very much mistaken, belongs to a company set up by the villagers to stop it going the way so many thousands of our pubs have gone in recent years, and getting turned into a private house. We wish them all the luck in the world, but if their online reviews are anything to go by, they are making a fine job of it and don't really need our good wishes. The Church of St Mary Magdalene consists of chancel, nave, north and south aisles, a vestry on the north side of the chancel, south chapel, south porch, and an embattled west tower. The earliest features of the building date from the 12th century. For example, the southern respond of the 12th century chancel arch remains embedded in the wall behind the pulpit. The south aisle, which retains its original doorway and 2 3-light lancet windows, is narrower than the north aisle, which is slightly later in date. The greater width of the northern aisle was probably determined by the presence of a 12th century transept at its east end. Early in the 14th century, new windows were inserted in the chancel and at the east end of the north aisle. The clerestory was also constructed in the 14th century, but the 2 easternmost windows on the south side were replaced by larger 3-light windows in the 15th century. The west tower was added before the end of the 14th century, and the vestry was built in the 15th. Until 1915, it had an upper room or loft reached by a ladder. The main fabric, including the chancel, was restored between 1887 and 1889 in accordance with the plans of the appropriately named Ewan Christian. The floor was relaid and new seats substituted for what Christian described as huge square pews and other expositions of bad taste. An eagle lectern carved by the village carpenter, one Mr. Bonham, was installed, and also a new oak pulpit. The small round window above the chancel arch was filled with stained glass representing St Mary Magdalene. Now, the restoration was not entirely well done. The new chancel roof was heavier than the old, and the chancel foundations had already been seriously undermined by the insertion of coffins, and in 1913 cracks began to appear in the chancel walls. Then the ceiling of the lower story of the vestry fell in. Further work was therefore carried out on the vestry, chancel and chapel in 1915 at considerable cost, and later more money was spent on the tower, clerestory, windows and chancel arch. The tower was extensively refaced and buttresses were added at the end of the chancel, simply to hold the walls up. The octagonal font bears the letters RMRS and the date 1666. In the south aisle are 2 rather wonderful medieval tomb recesses. The south chapel contains a monument to George Denton, who died in 1757, and 4 floor slabs, 2 of them armorial, to members of the Chamberlain family. The east window of the chapel was formerly blocked up, but was restored as a memorial to John, Lord Wardington, who died in 1950, and whose son, the second Lord Wardington, sold the above-mentioned Wardington Manor to its current owners. The church has a 6-bell peal, and there are mixed dates from 1669 to 1841. All originally came from the Bagley foundry in nearby Chatham. The bells were rehung in 1899. Heading back down Calabo Hill on our way to Cropperley for tales of an heroic Civil War battle, we passed through the village of Williamscote, or Wilmscote as it's called. It's a pretty little village, set around a village green, but it's a shadow of its former self. Until the mid-19th century, it was a thriving community with shops, inns, a blacksmith, and a cottage in which Charles I supposedly slept after the Battle of Cropredy. Unfortunately, the village fell into decline, and 35 buildings, including several farmhouses and all of the above-mentioned businesses, were demolished, and now it is a pretty residential settlement, relying entirely on its neighbouring villages for services. It's worth a brief visit, however, as the extraordinary stone from which its cottages are built gives the place a special atmosphere.